Hey there, economic warriors, recession watchers, and anyone who's still got $1 left in their bank account after this dumpster fire of a year, welcome back to Boss Economics World, where we rip the rose-tinted glasses off the government's face and show you the economic carnage they've unleashed. I'm your host, the loudmouth with the data, here to break down the Fed's latest clown show, Trump's tariff tantrums, and why your wallet's feeling lighter than a politician's promise. Buckle up, because today, we're diving headfirst into the Fed's June 2025 meeting, unpacking the economic mess behind it, and exposing how the government's mismanagement is driving us straight into a recessionary brick wall. Let's get to it. Alright, folks, let's start with the headline act. The Federal Reserve, under the fearless leadership of Jerome Wait-and-See Powell, has once again decided to do absolutely nothing. On June 18, 2025, the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, voted unanimously to keep the federal funds rate parked at a range of 4.25% to 4.5%, where it's been gathering dust since the start of the year. And if that wasn't enough to make your blood boil, they've penciled in a measly 2 rate cuts for all of 2025, you know, that magical year when they think the economy might stop imploding. But here's the kicker, the Fed's own projections show they're expecting weaker growth, higher inflation, and higher unemployment this year. So, let me get this straight, things are getting worse, but the Fed's like, nah, we're good to just chill. Sounds like a plan, if your plan is to crash the economy into a ditch. Now, let's talk about the growing divide among Fed policymakers, because this is where the real circus begins. 7 officials, now say there won't be any rate cuts this year, up from 4 back in March. Meanwhile, 10 others are clinging to the hope of 2 cuts by the end of 2025. Folks, this isn't a central bank, this is a room full of economists playing pin the tail on the donkey with your financial future. And what does Powell have to say about this chaos? Oh, he just brushes it off, saying, no one holds these rate paths with a lot of conviction. Gee, Jerome, that's super reassuring, my mortgage payment really appreciates your lack of conviction. But let's not let the Fed hog all the blame, because the real economic villain of 2025 is none other than President Donald Trump and his tariff obsession. Back in April, Trump unveiled a sweeping set of tariffs, slapping massive levies on imports in what he called a bold move to protect American jobs. Bold move? Sure, if you consider setting fire to the economy a bold move. These tariffs are already wreaking havoc, and the Fed's own forecasts back this up. They've slashed their 2025 growth forecast to 1.4% from 1.7%, jacked up their inflation estimate to 3% from 2.7%, and bumped their unemployment projection to 4.5%. Translation, slower growth, higher prices, and more people out of work. Thanks, Trump, really, making America great again, huh? And let's not forget the data, because here at Boss Economics World, we don't just rant, we bring the receipts. According to a recent study by the Peterson Institute for International Economics, Trump's tariffs could shave off 0.2% of U.S. GDP annually while increasing consumer prices by up to 1.5%. That's right, folks, your grocery bill, your car payment, your kids' back-to-school supplies. All going up, courtesy of Trump's tariff tantrum. And who's paying for it? You are. Powell himself admitted it at the press conference, saying, ultimately, the cost of the tariff has to be paid, and some of it will fall on the end consumer. Gee, thanks for the heads up, Jerome, too bad you're not doing anything about it. Now, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, because this tariff mess is just the tip of the iceberg. The Fed is stuck in an impossible dilemma, and it's all thanks to the government's mismanagement. On one hand, inflation is creeping up, 3% by the end of 2025, according to the Fed's own projections, and that's with tariffs only starting to bite. On the other hand, economic growth is tanking, and unemployment is ticking up. Normally, rising inflation calls for higher interest rates to cool things down, but weak growth and rising unemployment scream for lower rates to stimulate the economy. So, what does the Fed do? Nothing. They just sit there, twiddling their thumbs, while the economy burns. And let's talk about that inflation number for a second, because 3% might not sound like much, but it's a disaster for everyday Americans. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Consumer Price Index, CPI, for May 2025 showed a year-over-year increase of 3.3%, with core inflation, excluding food and energy, up 3.5%. Meanwhile, real wages, your actual purchasing power, grew by just 0.8% over the same period, per the Economic Policy Institute. What does that mean? It means your paycheck isn't keeping up with the rising cost of living, and you're effectively getting poorer every month. But hey, at least Trump's out there tweeting about how the Fed needs to cut rates because inflation's not a problem. Tell that to the single mom trying to afford groceries, Donnie. Folks, let's cut to the chase, we're not just flirting with a recession, we're practically engaged to one. The Fed's own data is screaming warning signs. Economic growth of 1.4%. That's anemic at best, and it's below the 2% threshold economists consider the bare minimum to keep unemployment stable. Speaking of unemployment, that 4.5% forecast might not sound bad compared to historical highs, but it's up from 4.1% at the start of 2025, per BLS data. And let's not forget the yield curve, because if there's one thing Boss Economics World loves, it's a good old-fashioned recession predictor. As of June 2025, the spread between the 10-year and 2-year U.S. Treasury yields is hovering dangerously close to inversion, a classic signal of an impending downturn. According to a 2024 analysis by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, an inverted yield curve has preceded every U.S. recession since 1950, with a lag of about 12 to 18 months. Tick-tock, folks. And if that's not enough to convince you, let's look at consumer confidence, because nothing says recession like a bunch of scared shoppers. The Conference Board's Consumer Confidence Index for May 2025 dropped to 97.8, down from 102.6 a year earlier, signaling growing pessimism about jobs and the economy. Meanwhile, retail sales growth has slowed to a measly 1.2% year-over-year, per the U.S. Census Bureau, as households tighten their belts. When consumers stop spending, businesses stop investing, and the whole economic machine grinds to a halt. But hey, at least the Fed's well-positioned to wait, right? Now, let's get to the heart of the matter, the government's role in this economic train wreck. Trump's tariffs are just one piece of the puzzle, albeit a big, ugly piece. But the broader story is one of fiscal mismanagement, political posturing, and a complete failure to address the structural issues plaguing the U.S. economy. Take the federal deficit, for example. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the U.S. deficit for fiscal year 2025 is projected to hit $1.9 trillion, or 6.7% of GDP, the highest level since World War II outside of the COVID-19 crisis. And what do we have to show for it? Crumbling infrastructure, a healthcare system that's still a mess, and a tax code that's tilted in favor of the ultra-wealthy. Meanwhile, Trump's pushing for more tax cuts, claiming it'll supercharge the economy. Sure, Donnie, because nothing says economic growth like piling on more debt while slapping tariffs on your trading partners. And let's not forget Congress, because they're just as complicit in this mess. While the Fed's busy navel-gazing, Congress has failed to pass any meaningful fiscal stimulus to offset the damage from tariffs and slowing growth. Remember the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021? Yeah, that was supposed to be a game-changer, but as of 2025, only 40% of the funds have been disbursed, according to the U.S. Department of Transportation. Meanwhile, partisan gridlock has stalled any new legislation to address rising inequality, supply chain bottlenecks, or workforce retraining. It's almost as if our elected leaders are more interested in scoring political points than actually fixing the economy. Shocking, I know. But let's circle back to Jerome Powell, because this guy deserves a special shout-out in the Hall of Economic Shame. At the press conference, Powell had the audacity to say the Fed's well-positioned to wait to learn more before making any policy changes. Really, Jerome? The economy's on fire, and you're just gonna roast marshmallows? And then there's his comment about the Fed's recent staff cuts, which he claims aren't at odds with his earlier testimony that the central bank wasn't overstaffed. Oh, okay, so you're just demonstrating that we are good stewards of public resources? Tell that to the millions of Americans who are struggling to pay their bills while you sit on your hands. Folks, this is the Powell paradox in a nutshell, a central banker who's either too apathetic to act or too incompetent to understand the gravity of the situation. And the data backs this up. According to a 2025 analysis by Bloomberg Economics, the Fed's inaction in the face of rising inflation and slowing growth has increased the probability of a recession to 45% within the next 12 months, up from 30% just 6 months ago. But hey, at least Powell's got his priorities straight, cutting staff instead of cutting rates. Brilliant. Alright, folks, let's wrap this up with the Boss Economics verdict, because the evidence is overwhelming. The government's mismanagement, whether it's Trump's tariffs, Congress's gridlock, or the Fed's inaction, is driving the U.S. economy straight into recession territory. Tariffs are jacking up prices and killing growth, the Fed sitting on its hands while inflation and unemployment rise, and Congress is too busy bickering to do anything about it. Meanwhile, everyday Americans are getting crushed, higher prices, slower wage growth, and a job market that's starting to crack. So, what's the solution? Well, if the government had any sense, they'd roll back the tariffs, pass targeted fiscal stimulus, and pressure the Fed to stop dithering and start cutting rates. But let's be real, none of that's gonna happen, because our leaders are more interested in political theater than economic reality. So, folks, it's up to you, stay informed, protect your finances, and don't fall for the government's spin. And hey, if you liked this video, smash that like button, subscribe to Boss Economics World, and share it with anyone who needs a wake-up call. Until next time, keep fighting the economic insanity, and remember, the government might be clueless, but you don't have to be.